The morning began like any other. The construction site was already alive before sunrise. The steady clatter of metal, the low hum of engines warming up, the smell of dust and concrete hanging in the air. Workers moved with practiced rhythm, boots scraping gravel, hard hats catching the pale light. Among them was a construction worker who didn't stand out. He wasn't new and he wasn't in charge. Just a man who showed up every day, clocked in on time, and did the work that needed doing. He carried his lunch in a dented metal pail, the same one he'd been using for years. Inside was a simple meal, nothing fancy, nothing extra, just enough to get him through a long shift. By late morning, the sun was already unforgiving. Sweat darkened his shirt as he stepped away from the noise to take a short break. Across the street, beyond the orange safety cones and caution tape, sat a man most people pretended not to see. He was sitting on the curb, back against a brick wall, clothes worn thin and layered in a way that didn't match the heat. His face was tired, not just exhausted, but worn down in a way that spoke of long nights and longer days. A cardboard sign rested beside him, the words faded and barely readable. Most workers didn't look. Some glanced and turned away. Others stared straight ahead as if the man weren't there at all. It wasn't cruelty, it was habit. People passed him every day. The construction worker noticed him because the man wasn't asking. No shouting, no reaching out, just sitting there, eyes lowered, hands folded together as if he'd already accepted whatever the day decided to give him. The worker opened his lunch pail. The smell of warm food rose into the air, and for a brief moment he hesitated. He still had hours left on his shift. His body already ached. This was all he had brought. Across the street, the man looked up. Their eyes met, just for a second. The homeless man didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't ask, and somehow that made it harder to ignore. The construction worker closed his lunch pail, then opened it again. He took a breath, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stepped off the curb. Crossing the street felt longer than it should have. Cars passed in steady bursts, drivers focused on green lights and schedules, unaware that a decision was unfolding just a few feet away. The construction worker waited for a break in traffic, then stepped forward, lunch pail swinging lightly at his side. Up close, the man on the curb looked older than he first appeared. Deep lines traced his face, not from age alone, but from exposure, sun, cold, sleepless nights. His eyes, though, were alert, observant, almost unsettlingly calm. The worker stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise from the construction site faded into the background, replaced by the distant hum of the city, tires on asphalt, a horn somewhere far off, the wind brushing loose paper along the sidewalk. The worker lifted the lunch pail slightly. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from dust and long hours. "You hungry?" The man hesitated, as if weighing the risk of answering honestly. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but it's okay, I'll manage." The worker nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. He opened the pail and held it out. "It's all I have," he said after a pause, "but you can have it." The man stared at the food, then back at the worker. "You sure?" he asked. "You're working all day." The worker shrugged. "I'll be fine." That wasn't entirely true, and both of them seemed to know it. But the worker didn't pull the pail back. He didn't explain. He didn't justify the choice. He just stood there, arm extended. The man accepted it carefully, almost reverently, as if the offer might disappear if he moved too fast. "Thank you," he said. The worker nodded once and stepped back. No speech, no sermon, no sense of expectation. Just a quiet exchange that went unnoticed by nearly everyone else. As the worker turned to leave, the man spoke again. "Why?" he asked. The worker stopped, thought for a second, then answered without turning around. "Because someone once did it for me." That was all. He crossed the street and returned to the site, blending back into the rhythm of work. Hammers struck steel, machines roared to life. The day continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But from the curb, the man watched him go, not with gratitude alone, with something else, something harder to name.
The construction worker didn't look back. He returned to the noise and motion of the site, picked up his tools, and fell into the familiar rhythm of labor. Muscles moved on instinct. Hands did what they had done 1,000 times before. If he felt the absence of his lunch later, he didn't show it. Across the street, the man ate slowly, not with the urgency of someone starving, but with intention. Each bite was measured, deliberate, as if he were paying attention to something far beyond the food itself. From time to time, his eyes lifted from the container, following the construction worker's movements. The worker felt it. That sensation you get when you know you're being watched, even without proof. He shifted, glanced briefly toward the street, but the man was looking down again, focused on the meal. It should have ended there, but something about the encounter lingered. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew heavy with heat. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Tools slipped more easily from sweaty hands. Tempers shortened. A foreman barked orders. A radio crackled with static. The worker wiped his brow and paused, chest tightening for reasons he couldn't explain. Across the street, the man had finished eating. He carefully closed the lunch pail, wiping the rim clean with a scrap of cloth. Then, instead of leaving, he remained seated, back straight, eyes lifted now, not just watching the worker, but the entire site. A truck backfired loudly. Several workers jumped. For a brief moment, everything felt off balance, as if the day had shifted slightly out of alignment. The construction worker turned again, this time more deliberately. The man was standing now. He hadn't been there a second ago, or maybe he had. The worker couldn't be sure. The sidewalk shimmered faintly in the heat, making shapes blur at the edges. Their eyes met again. This time, the gaze was different. There was no desperation in it, no hunger, no need, only recognition. The man nodded once, slow and intentional, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. The worker frowned, unsettled. He had helped strangers before, small gestures, passing moments, but none had left him feeling like this, like he'd stepped into something larger without meaning to. A horn blared nearby. When he looked back, the man was gone. No footsteps, no direction, no sign of where he'd gone. Only the empty curb, and the lunch pail placed neatly against the brick wall, untouched since the last bite. The construction worker stared at the empty curb longer than he meant to. The man hadn't walked away, at least not in any way that made sense. There was no alley nearby, no doorway he could have slipped into unnoticed. One moment he was there, standing in the heat, eyes locked onto the site, and the next, nothing. "Hey, you good?" A co-worker's voice snapped him back. The worker nodded, forcing a half smile, and bent to pick up his tools. Work resumed, but his focus didn't fully return. His movements were slower now, less automatic. Every so often, his eyes drifted back to the street. The lunch pail was still there, resting neatly against the brick wall, exactly where the man had been sitting. The worker's chest tightened. During the next break, he crossed the street again. Traffic flowed around him, indifferent. Up close, the pail looked cleaner than it should have. No crumbs, no smudges, almost as if it had never been used at all. Inside, it was empty, but something else caught his attention. At the bottom of the pail lay a folded piece of paper. The worker frowned. He was certain there hadn't been anything inside when he'd handed it over.
He unfolded it carefully, expecting a note, a thank you, maybe, or nothing at all. Instead, there were just a few words, written neatly, calmly, as if whoever had written them had all the time in the world. The message was simple, almost ordinary, but reading it sent a chill through him. It wasn't a signature, no name, no explanation, just a sentence that felt personal, as if it had been meant only for him. A sudden gust of wind rushed down the street, lifting dust and loose paper. For a brief moment, the sounds of the city dulled again, the same strange quiet he'd felt earlier. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Back on the site, the day seemed to drag. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across concrete and steel. Workers packed up tools, engines shut down one by one. As the worker removed his hard hat, he felt lighter than he should have. Not physically, but in a way he couldn't explain, like a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had quietly lifted. That night, at home, he unfolded the note again, read it slowly, then again, and for the first time since the encounter, a thought crossed his mind that made his hands tremble slightly. What if that man hadn't been just another stranger passing through?
The house was quiet. The construction worker sat at the small kitchen table long after dinner time had passed, the folded note resting between his hands. The overhead light flickered softly, casting shadows that stretched and shifted with every movement. The words were simple. No promises, no warnings, no explanations. Just a reminder, written as if the writer knew him, not the version others saw on the job site, but the man beneath the hard hat, the one who showed up every day, the one who carried more weight than anyone realized. He tried to dismiss it. Coincidence, he told himself, a strange moment, a tired mind filling in gaps where none existed. People disappear all the time. Cities swallow strangers whole. That didn't mean anything supernatural had happened. And yet, he slept poorly that night. Dreams came in fragments, unfamiliar streets, faces he couldn't quite see, a voice speaking calmly without sound. When he woke before dawn, his chest felt heavy, but not with fear, with something closer to clarity. The following morning, he returned to work. Same site, same street, same brick wall across the road. The curb was empty. Days passed, then weeks, but something had changed. He noticed people more, the ones usually overlooked, the man sweeping a parking lot before sunrise, the woman counting change at a bus stop, the tired eyes, the quiet patience. He didn't suddenly become generous or heroic. There were no grand gestures, no announcements, just small things. A coffee paid for without explanation, a pause instead of walking past, an extra minute given when no one was watching. The note stayed in his wallet, folded thin from being opened again and again. One evening, months later, he found himself back on that same street after work. The sun was setting, the brick wall glowing warm in the fading light. He stood there for a moment, unsure why he'd stopped. Then he understood. The meal hadn't been the gift. Neither had the note. The gift had been the moment of choice, the instant where he'd been given the chance to act without knowing the outcome, without recognition, without reward. And somewhere deep inside, he knew something else too, that whoever that man had been, he'd never truly been gone, because he was still there, in every quiet act of kindness, in every unseen decision, in every moment where someone chose to give what little they had. And that, he realized, was the point all along.